Good day, this is M.3 Science. My name is M.3. Now, people are always interested in why a generation would always look like the preceding generation or the next generation. A new baby may look like one of its parents. His eyes may have the same color as that of his dad's, or his nose may have the resemblance of his mother's. Now, if you want to know more about heredity, come on, let's learn with me. Heredity refers to the genetic heritage passed down from our biological parents. It's why we look like them. More specifically, it is the transmission of traits from one generation to the next. These traits can either be physical, such as eye color, blood type, or even a disease or a behavior. It is also called inheritance or biological inheritance. It is the passing out of traits from parents to their offspring, either through asexual reproduction or sexual reproduction. The offspring cells or organisms acquire the genetic information of their parents. Heredity is controlled by genes. Genes are the units of inheritance that determine the characteristics of an individual. The traits are passed down to the next generation through fertilization, the process where the male gamete fuses with the female gamete to form a zygote. Perhaps the most fundamental property of all living things is the ability to reproduce. All organisms inherit the genetic information specifying their structure and function from their parents. Likewise, all cells arise from pre-existing cells. So the genetic material must be replicated and passed from parent to the progeny cell at each cell division. The classical principles of genetics were deduced by Gregor Mendel in 1865 on the basis of the results of breeding experimentations on peas. Mendel studied the inheritance of a number of well-defined traits such as seed color and was able to deduce general rules for their transmission. In all cases, he could correctly interpret and the observed patterns of inheritance by assuming that each is determined by a pair of inherited factors, which are now called genes. Gene comes from the Greek word genus, meaning generation or birth. Genes are found in tiny spaghetti-like structures called chromosomes, and chromosomes are found inside cells. Your body is made up of billions and billions of cells. Cells are the very small units that make up all living things. A cell is so tiny that you can only see it using a strong microscope. Chromosomes come in matching sets of 2 or pairs, and there are hundreds and sometimes even thousands of genes in just one chromosome. The chromosomes and genes are made of DNA, which is short for deoxyribonucleic acid. Each gene has a special job to do. The DNA in a gene spells out specific instructions, much like a cookbook recipe, for making proteins in the cell. Like chromosomes, genes also come in pairs. Each of your parents has 2 copies of each of their genes, and each parent passes along just 1 copy to make up the genes that you have. Genes that are passed on to you determine many of your traits, such as your hair color and your skin color. Now, since human cells carry 2 copies of each chromosome, they have 2 versions of each gene. These different versions of a gene are called alleles. Alleles can either be dominant or recessive. Dominant alleles show their effect even if the individual only has one copy of the allele, also known as being heterozygous. For example, the allele for brown eyes is dominant. Therefore, you only need one copy of the brown eye allele to have brown eyes. Although with two copies, you will still have the same brown eyes. If both alleles are dominant, it is called codominance. The resulting characteristic is due to both alleles being expressed equally. An example would be the blood type or a blood group AB, which is the result of codominance of the A and B dominant alleles. Recessive alleles only show their effect if the individual has two copies of the allele, also known as being homozygous. For example, the allele for blue eyes is recessive. Therefore, to have blue eyes, you need to have two copies of the blue eye allele. In the nucleus of each cell, the DNA molecule is packaged into thread-like structures called chromosomes. Each chromosome is made up of DNA tightly coiled, many times around proteins called histones that support its structure. Each chromosome has a constriction point called the centromere, which divides the chromosome into two sections or arms. The short arm of the chromosome is labeled as the P arm, while the long arm of the chromosome is labeled as the Q arm. The location of the centromere on each chromosome gives the chromosome its characteristic X shape and can be used to help describe the location of specific genes. The three-dimensional structure of DNA, deduced in 1953 by James Watson and Francis Crick, has been the basis for present-day molecular biology. At the time of Watson and Crick's work, DNA was known to be a polymer composed of 4 nucleic acid bases, 2 purines, adenine and guanine, and 2 pyrimidines, cytosine and thymine, linked to phosphorylated sugars. DNA is an incredibly complex macromolecule. It is made up of a string of nucleotides which have a sugar and phosphate backbone, along with a combination of nitrogen bases. These bases pair together to make the DNA's trademark double helix. The bases are on the inside, oriented such that the hydrogen bonds are formed between purines and pyrimidines on opposite chains. The information in the DNA is stored as a code made up of 4 chemical bases: adenine, A, guanine, G, cytosine, C, and thymine, T. Human DNA consists of about 3 billion bases, and more than 99% of those bases are the same in all people. The order or sequence of these bases determines the information for building and maintaining an organism, similar to the way in which the letters of the alphabet appear in a certain order to form words and sentences. DNA bases pair up with each other, A with T and C with G, to form units called base pairs. Each base is also attached to a sugar molecule and a phosphate molecule. Together, a base, sugar, and phosphate are called nucleotide. Nucleotides are arranged in 2 long strands that form a spiral called a double helix. The structure of the double helix is somewhat like a ladder, with the base pairs forming the ladder's rungs, and the sugar and the phosphate molecules forming the vertical side pieces of the ladder. An important property of DNA is that it can replicate or make copies of itself. Each strand of DNA in the double helix can serve as a pattern for duplicating the sequences of bases. This is critical when cells divide because each new cell needs to have an exact copy of the DNA present in the old cell. That ends our lesson on inheritance. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, remember, science is cool.